It was a Thursday night in 1954, and the air was electric. The radio crackled with the sound of a guitar riff that seemed to come from another planet. Little Richard's Tutti Frutti blasted through speakers, sending shockwaves through the living rooms of America. Teenagers across the nation dropped their homework, their chores, and their grounded selves to dance like no one was watching. The world was about to change, and it all started with a few rebellious chords and a scream that echoed through the decades. In the late 1940s, America was a place of dreams and nightmares. The Second World War had ended, and the country was basking in the glow of victory. But beneath the surface, tensions were brewing. The Cold War was heating up, and the fear of communism was seeping into every aspect of life. Suburbia was booming, and the baby boomers were just starting to make their presence known. This was a time of contradictions, a time of innocence and rebellion, of conformity and chaos. In this world, a new sound was brewing. It was a sound that would challenge the status quo, a sound that would give voice to the voiceless. It was a sound that would become the soundtrack of a generation. This sound was called rock and roll. The birth of rock and roll was not a single event, but a series of moments, a confluence of cultural forces that collided to create something entirely new. It was the fusion of rhythm and blues, country and western, and a dash of pop that created a musical genre that would change the world. One of the early pioneers was Chuck Berry. With his electric guitar and his wit, Berry brought a new energy to the music. His songs, like Maybelline and Roll Over Beethoven, were about cars, girls, and the thrill of the open road. They spoke directly to the hearts of teenagers, who were yearning for something more than the safe, predictable world their parents had built. But it was Elvis Presley who would become the face of rock and roll. In 1956, Elvis burst onto the scene with a performance on the Milton Berle show that left the nation shocked and mesmerized. His hip-shaking, guitar strumming, and raw energy were unlike anything anyone had seen before. Elvis was a rebel, a king, and a cultural icon all rolled into one. He was the embodiment of the new America, a country that was ready to break free from the constraints of the past. Elvis's rise to fame was not just about music, it was about culture. It was about a generation that was tired of the old rules and ready to forge its own path. Rock and roll was more than just a genre. It was a movement. It was a way of life that celebrated individuality, freedom, and the power of youth. The media played a crucial role in the spread of rock and roll. Radio DJ like Alan Freed and Dewey Phillips were the gatekeepers, introducing new artists and songs to a hungry audience. Freed, in particular, was instrumental in popularizing the term rock and roll. He hosted live shows and radio programs that brought the music to a national audience. His shows were wild, chaotic, and utterly thrilling. Television also played a part. Shows like American Bandstand, hosted by Dick Clark, became a platform for young artists to showcase their talents. The show featured the latest dance moves and the hottest new songs, turning rock and roll into a national phenomenon. But rock and roll was not just about the big names. It was about the countless local bands and artists who were creating their own versions of the new sound. From the streets of New York to the juke joints of the South, rock and roll was a grassroots movement that touched every corner of the country. The impact of rock and roll was felt in every aspect of life. It influenced fashion, with teens adopting the styles of their favorite stars. It influenced language, with new slang and catchphrases becoming part of the daily conversation. It even influenced politics, as the music became a symbol of the changing times and the growing power of the youth. In the mid-1950s, America was a country in transition. The old ways were being challenged, and the new ways were being embraced. Rock and roll was at the forefront of this change. It was a force that could not be contained, a sound that would echo through the decades and shape the world we live in today. The story of rock and roll is a story of rebellion, of creativity, and of the power of music to bring people together. It is a story that began in the late 1940s and early 1950s, a story that continues to inspire and captivate new generations. It is a story of a world that changed, one song at a time. Elvis Presley and Junior Parker both recorded Mystery Train for Sam Phillips's Sun label, but their versions were worlds apart. Junior Parker's was slow and soulful, with a bluesy vibe that matched the sad tale of a lost love. The music added to the gloom, with train-like instrumentals and a wailing sax that made you feel the pain. The song ended with a train hissing to a stop, leaving the singer with little hope. Elvis's version, on the other hand, was a completely different ride. It was faster, blending R&B with country and western. The song felt more upbeat, with Elvis's voice bouncing around an echo, like he was trying to escape the darkness. Scotty Moore's guitar and Bill Black's bass made it feel like a train that couldn't slow down. Elvis's version ended with a train whistle, hinting at a more hopeful future. His young audience could relate to this defiant, optimistic feel, while Parker's audience, mostly African American, connected with the darker, more realistic message. Mystery Train is a perfect metaphor for early rock and roll. It shows how the new genre was a mix of different styles, R&B and country and western, creating something new. Rock and roll wasn't just a copy of R&B. It had its own unique feel and message, one that resonated with white teenagers. The song's mysterious title also reflects the confusion and excitement around the rise of rock and roll. It's like a speeding train that reveals a changing America, where racial boundaries blur and a new youth culture emerges. Rock and roll didn't just appear out of nowhere. Its roots go back to the early 20th century. Some say it started with the ring shouts of African American slaves. Others point to gospel music and spirituals from the 1920s and 1930s. Even earlier pop songs like Duke Ellington's Rockin' in Rhythm and the Boswell Sisters' Rock and Roll used the words rock and roll to describe dancing. R&B artists also used these words to talk about partying and sex. Songs like Trixie Smith's My Man Rocks Me and Roy Brown's Good Rockin' Tonight were big hits in the R&B world. Country and western music also played a role. Artists like Jimmy Rogers and Hank Williams influenced early rock and roll. Songs like Hank Snow's I'm Movin' On and Hank Williams's Colleague showed how country music could blend with R&B. But rock and roll became something more when it combined elements from different genres. Jerry Wexler, a producer at Atlantic Records, explained it best. Rock and roll developed because white people started listening to black music. They tried to play it, and those who kept at it became as good as their black role models, but it wasn't the same. It became something else. This new music was a mix of different cultures and influences, reflecting the changing times and the growing civil rights movement. Rhythm and blues, or R&B, was a key part of rock and roll's roots. Before World War II, black music was often called race music. But as the civil rights movement gained momentum, the term became embarrassing. In 1949, Jerry Wexler suggested rhythm and blues as a better name. This new term stuck and described music aimed at black audiences. R&B emerged from significant changes in American society. During and after the World Wars, millions of African Americans moved from the South to cities in the North and West, looking for better jobs and a chance to escape racism. Chicago, for example, saw its black population jump from 40,000 in 1910 to 500,000 by 1950. These migrants brought their music with them, particularly blues and gospel. Blues and gospel were closely related. Some say blues was just gospel with secular themes. Blues singers like Big Bill Broonzy, Blind Lemon Jefferson, and Sonny Boy Williamson played in Chicago's bars, bringing the sound of the Mississippi Delta to the city. The new urban setting changed the music. One big change was the introduction of the electric guitar. By the late 1930s, T-Bone Walker was using it in blues, and by the 1940s, Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf adopted it too. The electric guitar helped them be heard in noisy bars and added a new dimension to their sound. Les Paul and Leo Fender were two key figures in the development of the electric guitar. Les Paul, a musician and inventor, created a solid-body electric guitar with twin pickups. He and his wife, Mary Ford, had big hits in the 1950s, and his guitar design became a favorite among rock and roll musicians. Leo Fender, an inventor and manufacturer, made affordable electric guitars that were widely used by early rock and rollers. His Stratocaster, in particular, became a classic, used by artists like Buddy Holly, Jimi Hendrix, and George Harrison. The electric guitar transformed blues music. It gave it a new, louder sound and a backbeat that made it more danceable. The music also adopted structures from gospel and pop, making it more varied and complex. This new sound, with its powerful rhythm and emotional intensity, laid the foundation for rock and roll. By the early 1950s, rock and roll was on the rise, and it would soon change American music forever. Electric guitars, organs, and basses joined forces with tenor saxes and drums to create a new kind of music that had driving rhythms and danceable beats. By the late 1940s, this electrified urban blues was a mix of blues, gospel, swing, jazz, boogie-woogie, pop, and country and western. Groups like Billy Ward and the Dominoes blended gospel with blues, while the Orioles mixed white pop harmonies with jazz bebop. Fats Domino combined New Orleans-style piano with country and western vocals, and Joe Turner mixed blues with gospel. This new sound, called rhythm and blues R&B, became the favorite music for black people living in urban areas. R&B reflected the hopes and fears of black people in post-World War II America. Unlike traditional country blues, which often talked about despair and resignation, R&B captured the optimism of working-class blacks. It promised material goods, sensual pleasures, and a good dance beat, offering a temporary escape from hard labor in factories and stockyards. However, R&B also caused concern in an era known for its conservatism. With moderate politicians like Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower in office, and conservative critics watching out for any threats to American culture, music that didn't fit mainstream values was suspicious. R&B was seen as degrading, and not for respectable people. Many middle-class blacks and whites condemned R&B as the devil's music, and pushed for censorship of its lewd lyrics. Upper and middle-class African Americans were also upset by R&B stereotypes, which often came from white composers, depicting blacks as lazy and only interested in alcohol, gambling, and sex. One of the most famous R&B hits from 1951, Rocket 88, by Jackie Brenston, used car imagery to talk about sex and partying. The song's label, Chess Records, even ran an ad showing a girl in a skimpy bathing suit straddling a big rocket. Another hit, 60-Minute Man by the Dominoes, had the singer boasting about his sexual skills. Other risque songs included Big Long Slidden Thing by Dinah Washington, It Ain't the Meat, It's the Motion by the Swallows, and Baby, Let Me Bang Your Box by the Toppers. Despite the objections, R&B grew more popular. Small, independent record companies, or indies, played a big role in this. During the 1930s and 1940s, major record companies like Capitol, Mercury, Columbia, Decca, and RCA had stopped making blues music, thinking the audience was too small. When these major companies slowed down or stopped operations during a musicians' strike in 1942 to 1943, indies filled the gap by signing new musicians and writers. A feud between two music publishing groups also helped indies. The American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, ASCAP, had a monopoly on popular music, but in 1939, radio stations formed their own group, Broadcast Music Incorporated BMI, and started a boycott of ASCAP music. BMI had to look for new music, and they found it in country and western, folk, and rhythm and blues. This opened up many opportunities for indies to publish and play R&B on the radio. Hundreds of independent record companies sprang up in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Some of the most successful were Atlantic Records in New York, Chess in Chicago, King Federal in Cincinnati, Ace in New Orleans, Savoy in Newark, Peacock in Houston, and Imperial and Specialty in Los Angeles. Some owners, like Art Roop of Specialty Records, were moved by the music. Others, like Sid Nathan of King Records, saw a chance to make money by targeting the music of the little people, even though major labels didn't think much of records that sold only a few hundred or 1,000 copies. These numbers were enough for indies to make big profits. The African American market for R&B was growing and becoming more prosperous, and indies found ways to make even more money by paying artists small lump sums or tricking them into signing away songwriting credits and publishing rights. New recording technology also helped indies. Magnetic tape recorders, developed in Germany during the war, made it possible for small companies to record artists anywhere in the U.S. for less than $1,000. These recorders offered better sound quality and easier editing, making it easier for indies to produce and sell records locally. The rise of television in the 1940s and 1950s also affected radio. To stay competitive, radio stations started narrowcasting, focusing on specific audiences. Stations in cities with large black populations found success with R&B. This helped spread the sound to a new group of listeners, white teenagers. White teenagers across the country discovered R&B by tuning in to radio shows late at night. They were tired of the music they usually heard, like Doris Day and Perry Como, and were drawn to the heavy beats and gritty lyrics of R&B. Stations like WLAC in Nashville, with its powerful signal, reached millions of white teenagers who were eager to hear this new sound. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, more and more radio stations were playing R&B to reach black consumers. However, many of the DJ playing R&B were white. Some, like Bill Gordon in Memphis and Daddy Gene Nobles in Nashville, started playing R&B as early as 1946. Others, like George Hound Dog, Lawrence in Buffalo, and Alan Moondog Freed in Cleveland, joined in the early 1950s. Many of these white DJ adopted the vocal styles of African Americans, either to appeal to black listeners or because it came naturally to them. Sometimes, listeners couldn't tell if a DJ was white or black, which made for some surprising moments. This was especially true for teenagers who assumed they were listening to black DJ, but were often wrong. Despite the challenges, R&B continued to grow and influence music, culture, and society in ways that would shape the future of American music. Dewey Phillips was a unique figure in the world of radio. With his flaming red hair, pale freckled face, and lightning-fast speech, he hosted Red Hot and Blue, a nightly R&B show on WHBQ in Memphis. His chatter was a wild mix of words and sounds, making him sound more like an auctioneer than a radio host. He sold everything from flour to hair straighteners, all while setting the stage for gritty Delta blues. Many listeners thought he was African American because of his use of black slang and his genuine love for the music. But Dewey was more than just an imitator. He was a product of the multicultural South where he grew up. His show was a hit with both black and white audiences. People around Memphis were buzzing with his catchphrase, "Tell 'em Phillips sent ya," and merchants who didn't even advertise on his show were curious about who this Phillips guy was. Joe Liggins and his Honeydrippers even wrote a tribute song called "Phillips Sent Me." Blues singer Rufus Thomas summed up Dewey's appeal. Dewey was not white. Dewey had no color. Not everyone was a fan, though. Some African Americans felt that white DJ like Dewey were mocking them or taking their jobs. The black press criticized white DJ, with one New York paper saying that Alan Freed's style was in bad taste and a disgrace to the Negro race. But most African Americans accepted white DJ, as long as they genuinely loved the music. Ben Fong Torres noted that the high ratings and packed audiences at live shows showed that black listeners saw these DJ as friends who shared their love for R&B. R&B DJ played a crucial role in bringing black music to a wider audience. They broadcast R&B in cities across the country, making it accessible to white teenagers who no longer had to sneak into juke joints or listen to R&B records in secret. This exposure led to increased record sales and more R&B concerts. White DJ made R&B less objectionable for some whites, and the music's presence on predominantly white stations gave it a new cultural status among blacks. These DJ were cultural brokers, bridging the gap between white and black America. They became more than just announcers. They were trusted friends and advisors to teenagers. White DJ introduced millions of white teens to black culture, slang, and fashion. They were the guides to a world of excitement and liberation that appealed to the nonconformist spirit of the 1950s. The spread of R&B on white radio stations was an early step toward cultural integration. At a time when segregation was the norm, R&B DJ brought black musicians into the homes and bedrooms of white America. This exposure helped change attitudes, making white listeners more tolerant of black culture and giving black Americans a sense of pride in their heritage. For example, black DJ Al Benson never tried to sound white, and his efforts to distribute copies of the U.S. Constitution in Mississippi were seen as a bold stand for civil rights. Jukeboxes also played a crucial role in the spread of R&B. By the late 1940s, jukeboxes were everywhere: bars, diners, skating rinks, and more. They offered a variety of music, including R&B, and were a source of big profits. Records that cost 35 cents could score hundreds of plays at a nickel or dime each. By 1940, about 44% of all records were sold to jukebox operators. Advertisements highlighted the popularity of R&B, and white teenagers were eager to hear the new sound. Historian C. Warren Vanderhill remembers the transition in the mid-1950s when R&B started appearing on jukeboxes, replacing pop music by artists like Rosemary Clooney and Frankie Lane. R&B concerts were another venue where white teenagers could experience the music live. Famous clubs like the Apollo in Harlem and the Howard in Washington, D.C., showcased black talent. The Chitlin Circuit, a network of bars and nightclubs, existed across the country. In 1951, a trade paper reported that R&B clubs on the West Coast were thriving, with audiences that were 30 to 60% white. DJ like Hunter Hancock and Alan Freed organized successful R&B concerts. Freed's Moondog Coronation Ball in 1952 drew thousands of young people, and his shows became a major force in the music industry. As the 1950s progressed, R&B concerts became more integrated. Freed's Moondog Birthday Ball in 1954 had a third of its audience white, and by 1955, one of his concerts in New York City had a 70% white audience. These events were symbolic of the breakdown of racial barriers. In 1949, white teenagers in Knoxville, Tennessee, defied segregation laws to dance with black R&B fans. The growing popularity of R&B led to more whites buying R&B records. Record store owners noticed the trend, and by 1952, white teenagers were buying R&B records in both black and white stores. OK Records even started shipping R&B records to white pop outlets. This shift in the music industry was a sign of changing times, where R&B was becoming a unifying force in American culture. By the early 1950s, black rhythm and blues R&B was spreading like wildfire to white audiences. This shift wasn't just a musical trend, it was a cultural revolution. Jerry Wexler, who joined Atlantic Records in 1953, had a front row seat to this transformation. He believed the trend started in the South, where Southern white kids began buying R&B records and listening to them on the radio. It was Southern proletarian, Southern agrarian, Wexler explained. These people, truck drivers, farm hands, worked together. Their churches were very much alike. A white Baptist church had the same screaming and carrying on as a black Baptist church, the euphoria, speaking in tongues, the falling down, rigidity, tambourines, responses, and the minister blues talking. But the spread of R&B wasn't limited to the South. In cities like Los Angeles, Cleveland, and Buffalo, white DJ like Hunter Hancock, Alan Freed, and George Hound Dog Lawrence were already playing R&B music by the late 1940s and early 1950s. Their radio waves reached both black and white listeners, and the music was catching on fast. By 1953, R&B had become a nationwide phenomenon among young white audiences. These teenagers were not just casual listeners, they were passionate fans. They listened to R&B on the radio, played it on jukeboxes, attended R&B concerts, and bought the latest records by their favorite artists. Why were white teenagers so drawn to R&B? For one, the music was fresh and exciting. The pop music of the time, with artists like Perry Como and Eddie Fisher, was often seen as bland and boring. Young people wanted something new, something that spoke to them, something with a lively beat that made them want to dance. R&B fit the bill perfectly. Sam Phillips, the founder of Sun Records, noticed this trend early on. White teenagers were falling in love with Negro music. They wanted to hear that rocking, pounding, down-to-earth stuff, he said. Warren Vanderhill, a teenager from Queens, New York, remembers the appeal of R&B. It's the rhythm. It was dance music, he said. He and his friends would drive around listening to Fats Domino songs on the radio, even though the station was all the way in Memphis. When he went to college, his school frowned on dances, but he and his friends still loved R&B. They thought cat music was cool. R&B also had a rebellious edge. Many adults didn't like the new music, which only made it more appealing to teenagers. The idea of forbidden fruit made R&B more tempting. Black performers and their music represented a different way of life. one that seemed freer and more exciting. Historians like Eric Lott and Michael Burt and have noted that throughout American history, white people often looked to black culture as a symbol of personal freedom and rebellion against middle-class norms. In the 1950s, this trend continued. Writers like Norman Mailer and Jack Kerouac romanticized black culture as a source of liberation and authenticity. White teenagers who embraced R&B were part of this broader cultural shift. Black R&B singers like Rufus Thomas summed it up succinctly: "If you could be black for one Saturday night, you never would want to be white anymore." This sentiment captured the allure of R&B for white teenagers. They saw it as a way to break free from the conformity of their own culture and experience something different and exciting. The growing popularity of R&B had significant implications for race relations. As white teenagers began buying R&B records, cheering black performers, and attending R&B concerts, the seeds of integration were being planted. Cashbox magazine noted in 1955, "Rhythm and blues music no longer is limited to what used to be considered a rhythm and blues audience. People are just recognizing that the tastes of other people in other regions are as valid as their own." This openness to new music and cultures was a sign of changing times. R&B's influence extended beyond just the music. Songs like Wynonie Harris's "Good Rockin' Tonight" and Jimmy Preston's "Rock the Joint" used terms that would later define rock and roll. These songs, with their electric guitars, prominent rhythms, and emotional vocals, were the precursors to early rock and roll. By the mid-1950s, several R&B songs were crossing over onto the pop charts. The Orioles' "It's Too Soon to Know" reached number 13 in 1948, and the Dominoes' "60-Minute Man" climbed to number 17 in 1951. These successes were not just musical milestones, they were social ones as well. As African Americans gained more visibility in the post-World War II era, the civil rights movement gained momentum. Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in baseball, President Truman desegregated the military, and shows like Amos and Andy brought black performers into living rooms across the country. R&B was part of this broader cultural shift, helping to break down racial barriers and pave the way for the integration that would follow. Despite its growing popularity, R&B was still primarily a black music, performed by black artists for black audiences, but that was about to change. White artists like Elvis Presley were on the horizon, and they would soon bring R&B to an even wider audience. The question posed in Wynonie Harris's 1948 hit "Good Rockin' Tonight" was about to be answered. Have you heard the news? There's good rockin' tonight. The era of rock and roll was just beginning, and it would never be the same. In September 1954, a young man named Elvis Presley walked into a small recording studio at Sun Records in Memphis, Tennessee. The address was 706 Union Avenue, and not many people knew what was about to happen there. Elvis was going to record a new version of a song called "Good Rockin' Tonight," originally made famous by R&B singer Wynonie Harris in 1948. Wynonie Harris's version of "Good Rockin' Tonight" had a smooth, controlled sound. His voice was deep and rhythmic, and the music had a steady, slow beat. The band behind him included a saxophone and some hand claps that kept the rhythm going. It was a typical R&B song of its time, made for black listeners. But when Elvis recorded his version, everything changed. His voice was young and full of energy, jumping up and down with excitement. The tempo was faster, and the sound was more intense. Instead of a full band, Elvis had just two other musicians with him, Scotty Moore on electric guitar and Bill Black on bass. They created a new, high-energy sound that was thrilling and exciting. Elvis also changed some of the lyrics. While Wynonie talked about R&B parties and other songs, Elvis kept shouting, "We're gonna rock. Let's rock. Come on, rock." This new version of "Good Rockin' Tonight" was aimed at a different audience. Wynonie Harris was singing for black listeners, but Elvis was singing to white teenagers. By 1954, the song had transformed from R&B into something new: rock and roll. It was a blend of black and white music, and it was about to take the country by storm. Elvis wasn't the first white singer to be influenced by African American music. White musicians had been borrowing from black music for a long time. In the 19th and 20th centuries, pop music often included elements from black spirituals, blues, ragtime, and jazz. Early country and western singers like Jimmie Rodgers and Hank Williams also incorporated black musical styles. Even in the 1950s, white pop artists like Frankie Laine and Johnny Ray were heavily influenced by black music. Frankie Laine's style was so influenced by black artists like Cab Calloway that many people thought he was black. Johnny Ray, too, was inspired by Billie Holiday, and when his first record came out, a lot of people assumed he was black. Another white musician who was deeply influenced by R&B was Bill Haley. Born in 1925 in Highland Park, Michigan, Bill grew up in Chester, Pennsylvania. His parents were musical. His mom played the piano, and his dad played the mandolin. Bill started playing guitar when he was 7, and became a fan of country and western music. He often entered amateur contests and loved performing. Bill Haley was different from other white musicians who were influenced by R&B because he aimed his music at white listeners. He copied R&B songs note for note, but made them appealing to a white audience. This approach helped pave the way for the rise of rock and roll. Bill Haley wasn't alone in his love for R&B. Other white musicians and industry professionals, like record company owners Ahmet Ertegun and Sid Nathan, producer Jerry Wexler, band leader Johnny Otis, and songwriters Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller, had been involved with R&B for years. They understood the power and appeal of this music, and saw its potential to reach a broader audience. By the mid-1950s, the popularity of R&B and its influence on white musicians was growing. Jukeboxes, radio shows, and nightclubs were playing more and more R&B music. Even in the segregated South, the love for this music was breaking down racial barriers. White teenagers were listening to R&B on the radio, buying R&B records, and attending concerts where black artists performed. This cultural mixing was a sign of the changing times, and it helped create the new genre of rock and roll. Elvis Presley's recording of Good Rockin' Tonight was a turning point. It showed that R&B could be transformed into a new kind of music that appealed to both black and white audiences. This blending of musical styles and the breaking down of racial barriers were key elements in the birth of rock and roll. The music that Elvis and others were creating was more than just entertainment. It was a powerful force that was changing the world. By the time Bill Haley was in his late teens, he was already a seasoned performer, singing with country and western bands that toured the Midwest and South. Despite his efforts, his early attempts at fame were met with little success. He tried various stage names like Silver Yodeling Bill and the Rambling Yodeler, and even fronted a band called the Four Aces of Western Swing, but nothing seemed to resonate with audiences. In 1947, feeling defeated and broke, Haley returned to his hometown of Chester. He found a job as a disc jockey and bandleader at a local radio station, where he hosted a daily show that allowed him to perform with his latest country and western group, Bill Haley and the Saddlemen. In June 1951, Haley's career took an unexpected turn. He decided to record black rhythm and blues, a genre that was largely unknown to white audiences at the time. There are two different versions of how this decision came about. According to Dave Miller, the owner of Essex Records, it was his idea. He had heard and bought a copy of Jackie Brenston's R&B hit, Rocket 88, while on a business trip in the South. Miller brought the record back to Philadelphia and asked Haley, who was already popular in the area, to record a new version. Miller had to convince Haley to do it, as it was a bold move for a white artist to cover a black R&B song. Haley, however, remembers it differently. He says that he was inspired by a show on his radio station called Judge Rhythm's Court, which featured an hour of rhythm and blues. This led him to think, why shouldn't a country and western act sing rhythm and blues music? He enjoyed singing R&B and saw no harm in mixing things up. Haley often found himself humming Jimmy Preston's R&B song, Rock the Joint, which was the ending theme of the show. When Miller approached him, Haley agreed to make some records, and they started with Rocket 88. Regardless of whose idea it was, this was a groundbreaking moment. It was the first time a white artist had consciously tried to duplicate the sound of a black R&B record. While cover records were not new, white artists covering black R&B was a novel concept. Haley's version of Rocket 88 sold 10,000 copies locally, a modest success that encouraged him to continue. He followed up with a cover of Jimmy Preston's Rock the Joint, which did even better, selling 75,000 copies. Haley and his band were convinced they were onto something. They realized they were no longer just a country and western act, but they weren't quite a rhythm and blues act either. To reach a wider audience, they decided to perform for free at local high schools, playing 183 assemblies in a year. This strategy paid off as they learned what the teenagers like. When the kids started moving, tapping their feet and clapping, the band knew they had found a winning formula. As their popularity grew, Haley realized that their name and image were confusing. The Saddlemen looked like a country and western band, but they sounded like rhythm and blues performers. To clarify their identity, Haley renamed the group Haley's Comets with Bill Haley and gave them a new look. They traded in their cowboy boots for tuxedos and tried to appear more modern. "We got rid of our cowboy boots and shaved off the sideburns," Haley explained. "We bought tuxedos and became a pop act." In 1953, Haley's Comets with Bill Haley released Crazy Man, Crazy, which became their first national hit. The song combined country and western with rhythm and blues, and it was aimed at white teenagers. It sold 1 million copies and reached number 12 on the national pop charts. The song's success was a turning point. It wasn't just a cover of an R&B song. It was a new creation, a blend of styles that became known as rock and roll. Haley's Comets managed 2 more hits in 1953, Fractured and Live It Up, both of which made it to the top 30. These successes opened the door for black R&B performers to gain more exposure on the predominantly white pop charts. Prior to Crazy Man, Crazy, only a handful of R&B songs had made it to the top 30. After Haley's hit, more R&B songs started to chart, including Fats Domino's Go Into the River and Joe Turner's Honey Hush. The gates of the pop music charts were thrown wide open in 1954. 10 R&B or R&B influenced records became top 30 hits, providing a soundtrack for the nation as the landmark civil rights case, Brown vs. Board of Education, made its way through the courts. White teenagers, hungry for music with a beat, were driving the trend. Jukebox operators reported that R&B was taking over the jukeboxes in almost every teenage hangout. One of the most intriguing aspects of this new sound was the R&B harmony style that later became known as doo-wop. Doo-wop featured a prominent bass singer, a soaring falsetto, and multiple voices providing complementary harmonies. The term doo-wop wasn't used until the 1970s, but the style was already popular in the 1950s. Groups like the Crows and the Five Satins were creating hits with their doo-wop harmonies, such as G and In the Still of the Night. Doo-wop had its roots in earlier African-American musical traditions, but it gained popularity in the post-World War II era. It was a way for black youths to create a unique sound with vocal harmony, often in informal settings like the street or school hall. Doo-wop took the old tradition of vocal harmonizing and attached it to the new rhythms of R&B and rock and roll, creating a sound that resonated with a generation of young people. By 1954, the music industry was changing, and rock and roll was emerging as a new genre. Bill Haley and his Comets were at the forefront of this revolution, and their success with Crazy Man, Crazy marked a significant moment in the birth of rock and roll. Haley's innovative approach to blending different styles and his determination to connect with a new audience paved the way for the music that would define the 1950s and beyond. The story of rock and roll is a tale of transformation, from the streets of Baltimore and New York to the airwaves of Cleveland and beyond. It's a story of how simple, heartfelt melodies and harmonies, often sung by young people on street corners, became the soundtrack of a generation. Early doo-wop, with its uncomplicated and straightforward sound, captured the essence of young love and the struggles of teenage life. Groups like the Spaniels, the Jewels, and the Moonglows created timeless classics with basic instrumentation and heartfelt lyrics. Billy Vera, a musician who knows the genre well, points out that while some of the best doo-wop was primitive and unschooled, there were also highly professional groups like the Moonglows and the Flamingos who rehearsed in real rehearsal halls and were skilled musicians. Doo-wop didn't just stay in the rhythm and blues scene. It quickly became a fundamental part of rock and roll. By 1954, doo-wop records were crossing over to white audiences, thanks in part to hits like the Crows' G. This song, recorded on George Goldner's Rama label, became a national hit after a Los Angeles DJ named Dick Huggy Boy Hug played it repeatedly because his girlfriend loved it. The exposure on a popular radio station in Los Angeles helped the song climb to number 17 on the national pop charts. The success of G opened the doors for other R&B doo-wop songs to find their way into the mainstream. Groups like the Clovers, the Moonglows, the Spaniels, the Penguins, and the Chords started seeing their songs become hits. This led to a cover record craze, where white artists and groups started recording their own versions of these R&B hits. The Maguire sisters, known for their polished pop-style harmonies, took the Spaniels' Good Night, Sweetheart, Good Night to number 7 on the pop charts. The Crew Cuts, a group of well-groomed white teenagers from Toronto, covered the Chords' S.H. Boom and took it to number 1. S.H. Boom was a song that captured the imagination of many. Written by the Chords, it was inspired by the atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll. Despite its explosive title, the song's lyrics focused on romance rather than war. The Chords' original version, with its hoarse and strident opening and bright, unabating shuffle, became a hit on the R&B charts and even made it to number 5 on the pop charts. However, it was the Crew Cuts version that reached number 1, though the Chords' original is the one remembered today. Bill Haley, who had already had a hit with Crazy Man Crazy, was quick to join the cover record trend. He recorded a cleaner, more acceptable version of Joe Turner's Shake, Rattle, and Roll, which reached number 7 on the pop charts. Haley's approach of cleaning up the lyrics to make them more acceptable for a wider audience became a common practice in the industry. The cover record craze of 1955 and early 1956 transformed R&B from a niche genre into a mainstream phenomenon. This musical hybrid, blending black R&B, white pop, and country and western, needed a new name. That name, rock and roll, was popularized by disc jockey Alan Freed. While Freed didn't invent the term, which had been used in black music since the 1920s, he certainly helped make it a household name. Freed's journey to becoming a rock and roll icon began in Cleveland, Ohio, where he was approached by Leo Mintz, the owner of the record Rendezvous store. Mintz noticed that white teenagers were buying R&B records and suggested that Freed play this music on his radio show. Initially hesitant, Freed eventually agreed and launched his Moondog Rock and Roll show on WGW Cleveland. His show and the concerts he organized brought R&B to a wider audience and helped cement rock and roll's place in popular culture. By the end of 1954, rock and roll had become a force to be reckoned with. It was no longer just a niche genre. It was a musical revolution that would continue to evolve and influence generations to come. The story of rock and roll is a testament to the power of music to bring people together, to break down barriers, and to create something new and exciting.